So that was an interesting presentation. Let's go back up the slide. So it's kind of ironic that Bitcoin. It's kind of ironic that Bitcoin Jesus was on stage fighting Bitcoin, and me, the creator of Litecoin, is going to come defend Bitcoin and explain what actually makes Bitcoin valuable. So today I'm going to talk about the intrinsic value of cryptocurrencies, but I'm going to focus on Bitcoin, but it also applies to like Litecoin. So, is there intrinsic value in Bitcoin? Right, here's a quote from the current US Fed chair. It's not really a currency, it doesn't really have any intrinsic value, so I think there are investor and consumer protection issues as well. Then we have Peter Schiff, a very famous gold bug. Well, it's not digital gold, I agree. It's digital fool's gold. People own it because they think it's going to be more valuable in the future, but it has no intrinsic value. So here's someone who's a lot more knowledgeable, who says cryptocurrencies have intrinsic value. And here I'm going to, in the next like 20-30 minutes, I'm going to explain why cryptocurrencies have intrinsic value. So I'm going to talk about 4 properties of Bitcoin that gives Bitcoin intrinsic value. And in all due respect to Roger Ver and others, there's only one Bitcoin. Bitcoin's intrinsic value comes from, 1, censorship resistance. What that means is that you can send Bitcoin to anyone, anywhere, and it can't be censored by any one person, any company, or any government. Bitcoin has transaction immutability. Once transactions are confirmed in the blockchain, nobody can reverse it, nobody can take it away. Bitcoin has a cost of production. It's not free to create Bitcoin. You can't counterfeit Bitcoin. And lastly, Bitcoin has a fixed money supply, right? We all know that there'll be a total of 21 million Bitcoins in existence, and you can't just change that schedule. So first, I want to talk about Bitcoin censorship resistance. And to do that, I have an example about poker. Who actually played poker last night? Yeah, so poker, is it a game of skill or a game of luck? So if you ever play poker, you kind of, well, let me ask the audience, who thinks it's a game of luck? Who thinks it's a game of skill? Okay, so most people who've actually played poker agree that it's a game of skill. It's a lot less gambling than like craps or blackjack. So back in like 2010, 2011, I played online poker. Who's actually played online poker? So online poker was a huge business back in 2011. Like, I think I estimate about $10 billion business. And it was actually cutting into Las Vegas gambling profits, from what people are saying. And then on April 15 of 2011, I went to my favorite poker website, PokerStars.com, and I saw this. What happened was the US federal government on that day shut down all major US poker sites. The 3 major sites were shut down due to money laundering, bank fraud, wire fraud. 75 bank accounts were seized, and all the payments to poker sites were blocked. Visa payments, MasterCard payments, bank payments, and any payment processes. Online poker was effectively censored. And if you ask people, it's because a special interest group didn't like poker. Didn't like online poker because it was cutting into their profits, and they managed to get the US government to be on their side and to shut down poker. So when that happened, I was thinking to myself, this is really sad, right? Like, it's my money. Why can't I use it to play poker online? When poker is legal, it's a game of skill. So there's something screwed up, right? And a couple months after that, I found out about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not controlled by any governments. It's not controlled by any corporations. And it's basically, people talk about freedom of money, right? With Bitcoin, you can play online poker, no one can stop you. If you really want, you can also buy drugs on Silk Road, though I don't recommend it. And the idea is that Bitcoin cannot be blocked from spending. And that actually is very, very valuable. Next, I'm going to talk about transaction immutability. So this probably gets a bit more complicated. I'm not sure how many people understand how blockchains work. So the reason why transactions are immutable is due to the blockchain design and proof of work. So if you look at the if you look at the graph on the picture on the right, you see that each block has the hash of the previous block header in the block. So this is how the blocks are linked together, and that's why it's called a blockchain. What exactly that means is that if you change, in this example, if you change a transaction in block 1, it will change the transaction hash of the whole block header, which causes block 2 to be invalid. So that means, like, if there's a lot of work done to mine block 1 and then block 2 and then block 3, if you want to like swap out a transaction or invalidate a transaction in block 1, you have to redo all that work for all 3 blocks. So this makes it that if transactions with more confirmations, harder to reverse, because you just have to overrun the network and do as much proof of work as the whole network to actually attack it and undo a transaction. So I have this tweet from a little chicken on Twitter, and who follows this little chicken on Twitter? Okay, cool. If you don't, you should, because he's a pretty smart dude. The way I think about proof of work is the idea of burying the transaction ledger deep underground. Each new block pushes all other blocks further down, and in order to reverse a transaction that's buried, you have to dig that deep to get to it, and which costs a lot of money because of the proof of work. And this is what makes Bitcoin immutable. So to explain a little bit more, like if you can imagine, right, all the miners in the world are pushing this blockchain deep underground. And like if you have 6 confirmations, then it takes an hour of all the miners in the world to actually undo that. So if you're buying coffee, you may not even require one confirmation, because no one's going to spend the amount of money to reverse your coffee transaction. But if you send someone $1 million, that person may want to wait an hour or maybe a day. And once it's in a blockchain and there's a lot of blocks built on top of it, it's effectively immutable, right? It's for all intents and purposes, it doesn't make sense for anyone to. It's not cost effective to change a transaction from yesterday, for example, because it would just cost too much. It would cost like $10 million, for example, to change that transaction. And if that transaction is only moving $1 million, it's cost prohibitive to undo it. So for all intents and purposes, Bitcoin is immutable. So with transaction immutability, it means that Bitcoin transactions cannot be reversed and that your money cannot be taken away. So cost of production. So on the right, you see a counterfeit or play money. So with US dollar, it's quite easy to counterfeit the US dollar. People have done that. But with Bitcoin, you can't really counterfeit Bitcoin. And I guess one example is Bitcoin Cash. From the point of view of the network, Bitcoin Cash is actually a counterfeit Bitcoin. Right? If a merchant accepts Bitcoin and someone sends that merchant Bitcoin Cash, and then because they're confused, right? They don't realize that Bitcoin Cash is not Bitcoin. The merchant can easily detect that they didn't receive the money because they just checked the block explorer for Bitcoin, or if they run a full node, they won't see the Bitcoin Cash transaction. So for Bitcoin, it's easy to detect this kind of counterfeit. And then also you cannot create extra Bitcoin. Right? Right now, for each block, 12.5 Bitcoins are created. Miners can't just create 13 or 20 or 25 Bitcoins because it's enforced by the code. If they change the code to create more Bitcoins per block, it will be rejected by the network. So you can't create extra Bitcoins that way. And lastly, the cost to create one Bitcoin is non-zero. Right? Because of the proof of work, because of competitive mining, everyone's competing to create Bitcoins, all these miners, there's a cost. So it's not free to create Bitcoin. And this cost, as measured by EliteFixtures.com in March of this year, is $4,700. So that's quite a bit of money. And that's one thing that actually, I believe, helps keep Bitcoin price high. Right? It gives Bitcoin intrinsic value because it actually costs $4,000 to create a Bitcoin. Lastly, Bitcoin has a fixed money supply. So on the right, you see the US dollar money supply, how it's increased over the years. It looks like an exponential increase of money supply, and that's just the way it is. So fiat money, the Federal Reserve decides when or if it wants to print more money. And then they use like fancy terms like quantitative easing to confuse the public because people don't realize that it's basically printing more money. And if you can zoom in looking at that chart, you see that like in 2008, there's a huge step up, and that was due to quantitative easing. So with fiat money, money gets devalued. But with Bitcoin, the schedule is set in code. Right? We all know that there will be 21 million Bitcoins created by the end, and every 4 years, the inflation rate gets halved. So this is known ahead of time. It can't be changed without consensus, and I don't think it will ever be changed. Right? People like the fact that Bitcoin has a fixed limited supply, and it's what gives Bitcoin value. So the fact that Bitcoin cannot be devalued by any person or government is very, very valuable. So let's recap. These are the 4 things that I think gives Bitcoin intrinsic value. Censorship resistant, what does that mean? It means it cannot be blocked from spending. Transaction immutability means that it cannot be reversed or taken away. Cost of production means that it cannot be counterfeited. And fixed money supply means that it cannot be inflated away. So add that all together. This is a new form of money that cannot be blocked from spending, cannot be reversed or taken away, cannot be counterfeited, and cannot be inflated away. If you think about that, that is extremely valuable. Right? We've never had something like that, ever. Right? This was created in 2008, 2009. And before that, in all of human history, we've never had money that's so perfect. And Bitcoin is sound money. But some people may say that we've had gold. Right? Gold is kind of similar. Like people call Bitcoin digital gold, but Bitcoin is actually a lot better than gold. With gold, it's physical. So although it's censorship resistant, in order to send a large amount of gold, you have to physically transport that. And that can be blocked by government bodies. Like if you try to, Bobby was talking about this just yesterday. If you try to carry money on the flight, you have to declare you have 10,000 if you have more than $10,000 worth of gold. Right? So that can be confiscated, that can be blocked. So it's not that censorship resistant. But with Bitcoin, it has all the properties of gold as sound money, but it's a lot better. And that's why people have talked about Bitcoin being a honey badger of money, right? Because it has such good properties of money, you just can't defeat it. It will just keep coming back, and although the price is low today, most people believe that it will just come roaring back in the future. So now that we understand the features that give Bitcoin intrinsic value, how does Bitcoin defend against attacks on these features? So let's talk about censorship resistance first. What does an attack look like? An attack on censorship resistance would be, let's say the government pressures some miners or pools to censor a transaction because it's a payment to what the government thinks is a terrorist, for example, or some illegal payments, or even like a online poker payment, right? If the government tries to do that with Bitcoin, like they do with Visa and MasterCard, what happens? So for Bitcoin, due to miner decentralization, miners in other jurisdictions would happily write those transactions into a block. And once they're in a block, it's immutable, right? So even if like a small percentage of miners are being forced to not confirm a transaction, others will. So because due to miner decentralization, censorship resistance works in Bitcoin. You can't really censor Bitcoin transactions. So second thing, transaction immutability. What would an attack on transaction immutability look like? It would be like a 51% attack, right? For those that don't know, if 51% of miners come together, they can work on a separate blockchain, a separate fork to reverse a transaction. So how do we defend against that? Similarly, it will be with miner decentralization, right? If the miners are decentralized, then it will be harder for miners to collude to do this kind of attack. And then also the proof of work makes the attack costly, right? It's not free. Unlike proof of stake, with proof of work, in order to perform an attack, you have to mine on a separate chain and then perform the attack. So it actually costs money. And because of that, there's no incentive to attack because you're actually destroying your own, miners are actually destroying their own profitability by attacking the network. Cost of production. What does an attack on cost of production look like? One example I can think of is if the SHA-256 mining is broken and broken in a way such that you can just mine Bitcoins for free, right? It doesn't cost any work, you can just easily create more Bitcoins, then the inflation schedule will go out of whack. So how does that get fixed? So normally when cryptography gets broken this way, it doesn't just all of a sudden break, it gets slowly broken. So we have time. With nodes decentralization, with people actually running Bitcoin nodes, we can come together as a community to decide to fix this problem and to do a hard fork. Because miners won't want to do a hard fork. They would rather make more money this way, right? If mining gets so easy that they can just print Bitcoin out of thin air, then they'll keep it. They're not going to change. But that's where nodes decentralization is important. That's why people always say that you should run your own node if you can. Lastly, fixed money supply. What does an attack on fixed money supply look like? It would be miners colluding to increase their block rewards. We've actually seen that before. When Bitcoin went from block reward went from 50 Bitcoins to 25 Bitcoins, some miners actually changed the code to stick with 50 Bitcoins because they didn't want to make half as much money. They wanted to keep it that way. But that fork was rejected because people were running nodes and they decided that, or people realized that miners don't have a full say. They can't just dictate how things go, right? Users decide on the inflation, the fixed money supply, and you can't just change it. So this is how Bitcoin defends its intrinsic value properties. Let me go back first. So if you look at all the four rows, what do you see in common? What's in common? What's common is that it's decentralization, right? So what if I told you decentralization is what gives Bitcoin value, right? It's what gives Bitcoin intrinsic value. A lot of people throw around this word decentralization all the time, but people don't actually realize this is like the key. Decentralization is the sole reason why Bitcoin is valuable. Without decentralization, you don't get these intrinsic value properties. And Bitcoin is worth as much as PayPal or Visa, MasterCard. So now that we're talking about Bitcoin, let's talk a little bit about altcoins. My favorite altcoin is Litecoin, as you may have guessed. How does these properties of intrinsic value apply to Litecoin? So, not surprisingly, I believe that Litecoin, I've worked on Litecoin, I made my kind of vision of Litecoin is to be sound money, just like Bitcoin. So I didn't change Litecoin I didn't hurt Litecoin in any of these properties. So let's talk a little bit about it. Litecoin is censorship resistant. Miners are very decentralized. Sometimes even more so than Bitcoin if you look at the mining pool kind of graph. Transaction is also immutable. It costs a lot to reverse a Litecoin transaction. There are hundreds of millions of dollars of hash rate protecting the Litecoin network. It's smaller than Bitcoin, so it's more easily reversed for Litecoin. It costs less to reverse a transaction on Litecoin than Bitcoin, but that doesn't make it easy or cheap. It's still very expensive. So that's why I've always said, for smaller payments, use Litecoin. And for larger payments, use Bitcoin because you need the security and the immutability of Bitcoin. Cost of production, Litecoin is cheaper to produce, but still a high cost. I would guess about $50 to produce in Litecoin today. And fixed money supply, Litecoin, similar to Bitcoin, has halvings every 4 years. And the total money supply would be 84 million, so that will never change. And I believe even if I try to change it, the users will revolt and it won't be changed. So how about Ethereum? Everyone's favorite altcoin, or most people's favorite altcoin. Ethereum is censorship resistant. I believe there's a lot of security around it. It's hard to censor Ethereum transaction. But the problem with Ethereum is we've already had a DAO fork, right? We've already shown and proven that transactions on Ethereum is not immutable. For most cases it is, but for any large issues like the DAO fork, the DAO hack, people have shown that they can come together and change it. So that actually, for some people, that's actually a good thing because you want to take money away from thieves. But it actually hurts the properties of sound money. Because once a transaction is mutable, what's to say you can't change another transaction? It sets a bad precedence. The governments can approach the Ethereum Foundation, the developers, and convince them that this transaction is bad because it's sending $1 million to a terrorist group. So no one likes terrorists, but for properties of sound money, it's important that transactions are immutable. Cost of production. Ethereum is currently being mined today, so there's a cost to produce. But once it's switched to proof of stake, the cost effectively goes to zero. And that really hurts the properties of sound money. And lastly, Ethereum's block reward decrease has just decreased, or has the developers last week came together, or the community came together and decided to decrease the block rewards from 3 to 2 ETH. And if you paid attention, Ethereum's money supply has changed over time. So it's decided by a relatively small group of people. And unfortunately, as an Ethereum user, you really have no say. It's not very different from the Federal Reserve deciding to print more money. So next hard fork, the reward will decrease from 3 to 2, and it's not up to the users to decide that. So because of that, Ethereum is not really money from my point of view. Now, everyone's favorite altcoin, I guess. People like to know, how does Bitcoin Cash, or Bcash, fit into all this, right? So, here it is. Is it censorship resistant? It is right now, but the problem with Bitcoin Cash is that it uses the same proof of work as Bitcoin. And right now, the Bitcoin Cash network has 6% of the total hash rate. So a small pool, or even a small mining farm, can effectively censor all of Bitcoin's transactions if they wanted to. So an effective attack would be, they would short Bitcoin Cash, and they just mine Bcash slowly and deny any other miners blocks. If they have, let's say, 7% of the total hash rate, they can do that. They can effectively censor every single Bitcoin Cash transaction on the network. And once that happens, all miners of Bitcoin Cash would actually quit mining Bitcoin Cash because all their blocks will be orphaned and they will be losing money. So they'll go back to mining Bitcoin. The price will crash, the pool or miner will make a lot of money. And then because there's Bitcoin, if Bitcoin Cash price crashes, and they kill the network, they just go back to mining Bitcoin. No harm done. Their miner hardware investment isn't gone to waste. Whereas like if you look at Litecoin or Bitcoin, these two coins dominate their respective mining algorithms. So if you attack Litecoin, if Litecoin miners attack Litecoin, they basically effectively destroy their miner hardware profitability because they're just killing their own coin. With Bitcoin Cash, it's not the same. Second, transaction immutability. Transactions, so if a miner attacks Bitcoin Cash, because the hash rate for Bitcoin Cash is so small compared to Bitcoin, like I said, a small mining farm or a miner pool can attack it. And if you look at a website, fork.lol, it shows some data. It actually takes 20 days for the Bitcoin hash rate to effectively wipe Bitcoin Cash out of existence. It could start from September or July, August of last year when Bitcoin Cash was created and mine all the blocks that Bitcoin Cash has. It takes 20 days to effectively remove all trace of Bitcoin Cash in history. So will that happen? No, because Bitcoin miners aren't going to waste their time doing that, right? It's not very profitable for them to do that. But it just shows that Bitcoin Cash transactions are much more easily reversed than Bitcoin transaction or Litecoin transaction because there's so little hash rate. Third, cost of production. So one thing people don't realize is ASIC boost is an optimization of mining. I believe people are running covert ASIC boost on Bitcoin, or on Bitcoin Cash. One of the reasons why we had such a heated debate last year was because miners were against upgrading to SegWit, because SegWit actually kills ASIC boost. And they were doing ASIC boost covertly. So they were actually mining Bitcoin a lot cheaply than other miners who didn't know about or who weren't using miners that have ASIC boost capabilities. And this really destroys some of the incentives, some of the properties of Bitcoin. So on Bitcoin, we did a user activity soft fork, and we added SegWit, and that killed covert ASIC boost. So it makes mining fair, right? So having unfair mining causes a lot of problems. And with Bitcoin Cash, it's happening right now, and we just wouldn't know it. Some miners are creating Bitcoin Cash for a lot cheaper price than all the other miners, and we wouldn't know it. And lastly, fixed money supply. Bitcoin Cash was all about miners are all that matters. Users running nodes don't have a say. If there's any issue, miners will decide and fork, and hash rate is all that matters. So with that, what does that mean? That means if miners at one point in time in the future decide that they want to keep the mining rewards high, they don't want to have every 4 years, because that's going to happen, right? People are greedy. When that happens with Bitcoin Cash, it's just going to go through because there's nobody to stand up against that. Whereas with Bitcoin and Litecoin, people run nodes. People won't be happy when miners try to change the money supply. Okay. So to summarize, the conclusion is Bitcoin and Litecoin have intrinsic value. Its censorship resistance cannot be blocked from spending, cannot be reversed or taken away, cannot be counterfeited, and cannot be devalued. Right? And decentralization is what gives cryptocurrency intrinsic value. And the corollary of that is without decentralization, the cryptocurrency will not sustain long-term value. And yeah, I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. So you've previously stated that Litecoin is the silver to Bitcoin's gold. Do you still stand by that? And if so, why?
Yeah, so I've always seen Litecoin as a complement to Bitcoin. Like I see Litecoin working alongside Bitcoin to handle global transaction needs of sound money. And with the creation of Lightning Network, I see that as more of a case because Lightning and Litecoin and Bitcoin are both on the Lightning Network. And being on that, you have atomic swaps where you can easily swap between Bitcoin and Litecoin. And I still see Litecoin being silver to Bitcoin's gold.
Thank you. And one more question. So you've recently updated your prediction to 1 million by 2020. Excuse me? Okay. Would you care to revise it in light of the current bear market and or any other conditions that you
I
foresee?
didn't make a Bitcoin price prediction, so I think you got that wrong. I don't like to make Bitcoin price predictions because if people tell you what the Bitcoin price will be at a certain time, they're just making shit up. And no one really knows. So yeah, it makes no sense to make Bitcoin price predictions.
Makes sense. And the last one, since we are at the same poker table, we do have a bit of a background on Satoshi with an interesting, I will just leave it at a repo. And can you explain if maybe Bitcoiners should be much more into poker?
Can you go into more details?
Yeah, absolutely. So Satoshi himself inserted, right, a unfinished poker application, to my understanding, inside the repo of the very first Bitcoin chat. So this is really a fun question too. Is there a lesson here, but also, are we Bitcoiners supposed to be at that poker tournament last night, or maybe on a poker team together?
Well, I think there's a synergy between poker and Bitcoin. So Satoshi, I guess, was liked to play poker. And maybe he created Bitcoin because he saw the need of being able to play poker without someone censoring your transaction. It's kind of a cool tidbit in the history of Bitcoin. I think the poker table was quickly removed from the source code. And that's because Satoshi saw that what he created was much more valuable than just an online poker game.
All right, thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.